violence against the opposition. Not a single Republican member has condemned this call for violence, not publicly, not privately. Not a single member has reached out to me, either publicly or privately. And with this, I am profoundly disappointed in my colleagues. As a member who has spent my entire career calling for civility and decency and building relationships with the other side of the aisle, I'm dumbfounded by the silence. People have asked us why now for this video that my colleagues and I recorded, and I'll tell you, this administration, as was mentioned by my colleagues, has repeatedly shown disregard for the military process. They've ignored dozens of court orders, fired hundreds of military lawyers, and gutted critical expertise within our armed forces. Given the president's track record, we have no choice than to take President Trump at his word, because he has shown time and time again that when he threatens to abuse his power, he acts on it. This kind of discourse fosters an environment where overreach and lawlessness become more likely, not less likely, and where the risk of being drawn into an unauthorized war and conflict grows, which is why we are here today, restoring constitutional guardrails at a moment when it is urgently, urgently needed. We've seen that this administration has overruled warnings from the JAG that lethal strikes in the Caribbean are not only illegal, but could constitute extrajudicial killings. We must not and we cannot allow this to go on further without Congress being involved. To date, Congress has not been presented with the intelligence, and so does not have confidence that recent military strikes in the Caribbean are lawful. More than 20 operations have been carried out without any congressional authorization, and a senior Southern commander, as mentioned, has resigned. That should alarm every single American who believes in the civilian control of the military and the adherence to our rule of law, which is why my colleagues and I are here readying legislation that would prohibit the use of any funds for military force in or against Venezuela unless Congress explicitly authorizes it. No president of any party can initiate war without the people's elected representatives saying so. That principle is foundational to our democracy, to our Constitution, and it's essential to our national security as well. We must pursue a strategy that is rooted in diplomacy, rooted in partnership and restraint, and not in unilateral escalation. So this legislation would ensure that any decision involving the use of force is deliberate, it is lawful, and it is accountable to the American people. I look forward very much to introducing this legislation with my colleagues and ensuring oversight by Congress is restored. It's my privilege to turn it over to Representative Panetta for his remarks, and thank you.
Thank you, Representative Houlihan, of course, Representative Moulton and my colleagues for this legislation, and thanks to all of you for being out here on this morning, let's put it that way. Again, I'm Jimmy Panetta from the 19th Congressional District, and prior to this position, I served as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan in 07-08. I was also a prosecutor in Oakland, California, as well as in Salinas, California, in which I prosecuted gang members and drug dealers. And I can tell you, in both lines of work, we use evidence and we use the law to reach our decisions. Unfortunately, when it comes to military actions in the Caribbean by this administration, it has failed to provide the evidence, failed to uphold the law, and failed to justify its use of force. That is why I support this legislation to prevent the use of funds for military action in Venezuela and to ensure that this administration properly uses the evidence and the law not only to kill people, but to take our country to war. Now, let me tell you what the facts do show right now is that the table is being set for military action in the region. Over 10% of our deployed naval assets are under the purview of Southcom. That's the largest military buildup since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's been a campaign of over 21 airstrikes against boats linked to drug smugglers that have killed 83 people. And they've redefined drug gangs as terrorists. All of this evidence points to a new war on narco terror that could easily lead to a costly military entanglement by a president who said he would end forever wars. Now, the law the administration is using to justify its gunboat diplomacy is fuzzy at best. They claim they're waging war on drug traffickers and using the war on terror as a template. But if you're going to war, as Representative Moulton said, you must go to Congress first. And if you don't do that, there must be evidence of hostilities or an imminent hostility towards the United States. We see none of that from this administration. No evidence of that, no abidance of the War Powers Act, and no evidence of justifying this use of force. As Representative Auchincloss accurately put it, there's no evidence that fentanyl is coming from Venezuela. There's zero evidence that these drug boats are going to the U.S. Outboard motor drug boats that would take 20 stops to refuel in order to make it to the United States. There's zero evidence of a long-term strategy to go after the root causes and root sources of the illegal narcotics that are on the streets of America. What I do see, though, and what I understand is that any attack on land, bringing conflict from international waters to sovereign territory, would be an extraordinary and expensive escalation that would pull our forces and focus away from the threats in Europe and the Pacific. And ladies and gentlemen, beyond the facts, beyond the law, there are our American values and our American standards. That when we engage in military force to kill people, we don't just blow up people to declare a victory. Because when we do that, that's unconstitutional, that's inhumane, and that's immoral. That's why this law is needed, to ensure that this administration has the evidence to justify their acts, to ensure that this administration understands that we are a nation of laws, and to ensure that this administration and any administration going forward always upholds our democratic values. With that, I turn it over to our good friend and colleague, Eugene Vindeman.
Thank you, everybody, for being here this morning on a very important topic. And I also want to start by addressing the president's heinous comments against several of my colleagues. So I want to start by condemning the president for calling for 6 Democratic members of Congress, all of whom are patriots, and all of whom served our country in various national security roles, to be hanged. It's the kind of thing we expect from a Saudi crown prince, not an American president. In fact, the president is currently the biggest accelerant of political violence in our country today. I want to say I'm grateful to my colleague Seth Moulton and all of my colleagues here for gathering us today as veterans of the global war on terrorism to address the lawlessness of this president. Seth and I served during the Iraq War, a war that was deeply flawed and a disaster of Republican policy. But it was, in fact, approved by Congress. The Constitution is clear. The nation can only go to war when Congress approves. This was true in Pearl Harbor. This was true after 9/11, and is still true today. That is why the president's actions in the Caribbean and any potential actions in Venezuela must be approved by Congress, considered by Congress. As an expert in international law and the law of war, as a JAG and an NSC advisor that advised senior leadership, both military and civilian, on when it was appropriate to go to war and the conduct of war, I have serious reservations about the legality of the president's strikes and concerns about the jeopardy that puts our service members in. I will tell you, as a prosecutor, as a JAG prosecutor, I was only following orders is not a valid excuse for committing war crimes. I've warned specifically senior officials in the Department of Defense, both uniform and civilian, about this issue. If there's a threat to our nation, we will meet it. If not, we should not put our sons and daughters in harm's way. I thank Seth for putting forth this legislation as a check on a war of choice in Venezuela, and I'm honored to stand here with my fellow Democratic veterans holding the line. Thank you.
I'll be happy to take questions, any of us here. You guys had to go, but yes, go ahead.
So there have been reports that Southcom senior JAG Colonel Paul, the administration's premise for the recent strikes? Would it make sense to reach out to him to testify before Congress?
We would love to see him testify before Congress. The reality is that this administration is disregarding the chain of command. They regularly fire people who disagree with them, and it's putting our troops in danger. The last time the Armed Services Committee got a briefing on the situation in Venezuela and in the waters surrounding it, I went up to the senior admiral at the end of that briefing and looked him in the eye and said, I hope you understand the constitutional peril that you are in and the constitutional peril that you are putting our troops in.
And I'll add, I also serve on the Armed Services Committee, but as well on the Intelligence Committee. The last time we received a briefing on Venezuela with the full committee was never. And that is something that should alarm everybody. The Congress is supposed to be aware of what the intelligence is that validates and justifies these sorts of attacks. And I will say that unfortunately, because the majority is the majority, they are not interested in bringing those folks in to testify in front of us, whether by them asking or subpoenaing them. And that's a failure of this Congress and this leadership.
I'll add, just from a legal perspective, after having reviewed the justification from the Department of Justice, the OLC opinion for the operations in Venezuela, I found that opinion wholly unconvincing. In fact, it seemed like it was written by somebody with very limited expertise in international law, in the law of armed conflict, and very clearly trying to push forward a new system of international law through customary practice of the United States, but nothing that is recognized by any other country, the UN Security Council, and frankly, that is a very dangerous, slippery slope.
That's good.
The legislation that you're putting forward is distinct from the war powers resolutions that have been introduced in recent weeks, including now in the House. Is this a sign from you all that you think that that approach is not working? And are you also supportive of the resolution that's now in the House?
I can certainly speak for myself. Very supportive of those war powers resolutions. But there's two things. I mean, I would say we need to do everything we can. And this is preemptive, right? This says, before the president were to, declare that he intends to take hostilities, we're setting down a marker. You're not going to get funding for Congress from this. You need to come to us for permission if you want to do it. And the second thing is, we have obviously been disappointed in the Republican response. I think there are a lot of Republicans who, proclaim America first, who say that we shouldn't get involved in needless wars overseas, like Donald Trump, and yet are completely acquiescing to this war of choice that he seems to want to start. Yes?
My question's for Congressman Vindman. I think it's safe to say most of us do not have experience in the armed forces. When a service member receives an order that they believe is unlawful, can you explain what the process is, what legally that looks like?
Yeah, so look, I've heard people claim that this is something that's going to be litigated in court. That's not how this works. When you're on the field of battle, when you're preparing to take an action that can result in somebody's death, that is a split-second decision that we expect and we train our soldiers to take in a moral, ethical way. We have the best service members on the planet, the best trained, the best prepared, and they're trained on ethics annually, or at least up until this point. I don't know if that's still the case with the new secretary. And so these are split-second decisions that we expect them to take. And typically, this is something that commanders down the line are providing guidance and direction on. But if this goes wrong, this results in the death of a living human being. And right now, the strikes that are taking place in the Caribbean and the Pacific, look, these may be drug smugglers. These may be some of them bad people. Some of them may be fishermen. What we do know for a fact is that we have sufficient evidence to strike and kill them, but we don't have sufficient evidence to detain them, because we know that we've already released 2 folks that survived these strikes. To me, that's kind of an outrageous fact pattern.
I actually spoke to Mike Rogers, I believe it was last week, about the arguments that he's heard from the administration. He went as far as to say that he thinks that the administration should take its argument to the American people, that there's a case to be made that he would argue is very strong for the executive branch exercising its powers in that way. I wonder, why do you think the case has not been made beyond to Congress as a whole, to the American people as a whole?
Because the case is incredibly weak, and so the administration wants to keep it hidden. Look, I have a lot of respect for Chairman Rogers. I couldn't disagree more strongly with his idea that this is a case that the administration would want to share. It's absolutely pathetic. I mean, this case wouldn't survive some mock court in high school. It's self-contradictory. It's ridiculous. And the reality is that if the administration were to share this with the American people would see with their own eyes how completely lawless this is.
So, look, the OLC opinion is classified, the entire thing. That is very atypical. There would actually be at least public portions of it, redacted portions of it, that would be historically releasable. We know that there are disagreements based on the reporting that y'all have made that from the lawyers. And so they are not comfortable taking a case forward when they internally, in fact, their own lawyers in the Department of Defense, folks that did the same job I did for the better part of 25 years, can't agree and can't provide legal authorizations for. And the president may be immune based on the Supreme Court decisions, but I would love for my Republican colleagues and the president to put America's sons and daughters first, and not put our service members in jeopardy with these likely illegal operations.
Yeah. Let me just add one more thing. When Congressman Vindman and I received the briefing on the House Armed Services Committee, a half hour before the briefing was to start, they canceled the lawyers. So every time we had a question, and it was not just Democrats, there were a few courageous, thoughtful Republicans who asked really tough questions because they too saw that this was a completely ridiculous legal opinion. And every time they asked those questions, the administration just said, well, sorry, the lawyers aren't here. Why are they hiding the lawyers from Congress even in a classified hearing? It's because they don't believe in their own justification. Take care. All right. Yeah.
Do you still believe that direct strikes against Venezuela are a red line for some of your Republican colleagues? Do you think if they took that step, the administration, that it would prompt backlash?
I mean, it's a great question. Are direct strikes a red line for my Republican colleagues? In private, absolutely. But they have shown absolutely zero political courage to simply tell the truth, share their own beliefs in public. And I think at the end of the day, if we do go to war with Venezuela, if we do conduct joint strikes, direct strikes, there will be a lot of Republicans who regret not doing the right thing up front. Just like there are a lot of people who regret not asking the tough questions and not taking the right vote when a prior president asked us to go to war in Iraq. Thank you all very much.